The main introduction of Dr. Art Green will come tomorrow before the plenary, and I was asked to share a very brief introduction. And I probably, like many of you, have had many opportunities in the past to learn from Rabbi Arthur. And I was thinking back upon them, reflecting upon them, and I was wondering whether any of them were on this topic of deep ecumenicism. And I recalled one that wasn't directly related to this. And I don't even remember what year it was or where it was. But I remember that Art was there, and Reb Zalman was supposed to be there, but couldn't be there because he was sick, and appeared on Skype. And they had a discussion, and the question was, what would bring about Moshiach? And it, of course, reflected on deeper understandings of Mashiach and Mashiach times and so on. And what I remember most about it, I do remember their divergent viewpoints. What I remembered most is the way they treated one another in the discussion while disagreeing with one another. And I said, surely, Elu ve'elu hadivrim Hashem, right? That surely these and these are the words of God, and they treated each other with such love and respect while holding these divergent ideas. And for me, that was the biggest learning I took from it, apart from the substantive ideas about Mashiach. And it caused me to think that this idea of deep, ecumenism, thank you, is really grounded in our tradition. Because that they can have different paths and yet have such love for one another and be willing to learn so much from one another. Taught me that they really got this at a deep level. And it's just a matter of taking that and using it with others that gets us to this place of what our whole conference is about. And the final thing I want to say is, I saw Art this morning, I guess it was, and he looked at my name tag and he said, well, you must be the only person who knows my work in Montana. And I got to say to my holy teacher that he's mistaken. Because, first of all, so many of my clergy colleagues have read Seek My Face on my recommendation, as have so many of my conversion students and many other students, that at our weekly Torah study, the 2-volume book, Speaking Torah, is often a source we go to, as is the translation of the Sfat Emet. And I also shared that so many of my congregants have on their refrigerators the 10 ways to keep Shabbat from Art's book on These Are the Words, I think.
You gotta write some more books for Montana.
So, Art's work is known far and wide, even in Montana. And if it's known in Montana, just think how much it is known throughout the world and how lucky we are to have him here with us today and share his wisdom. So Art, thank you for being with us, and I invite you to share a bissel of wisdom tonight, and we look forward to this entire time with you.
I guess I gotta go to Wyoming to be a stranger, what can I tell you? It's very late, folks. There have been a lot of words today. I sort of feel the Rahmanistic thing to do would be to say, okay, see you tomorrow. But I won't do that. I won't have that kind of Rahmanis on you. I won't have that kind of Rahmanis on myself. So a little bit, just a little bit of what's on my mind, which somehow will tie into the theme. You'll see how it does. And somehow is because it's what's on my mind and what I want to share. So Parshat Bo, we heard a lot about Parshat Bo this morning, this afternoon, going and coming and coming and going. But remember, Parshat Bo is the place where Rashi tells us the Torah should have started. Lo haytat haTorah tzricha latchil ela me'chodesh hazeh lachem. The Torah really didn't have to begin until you get to the first commandment to the Jews, which is, This month will be the first of months, and that's where the Torah, as legislation to the Jews, really begins. So what's the whole rest of the Torah doing there? And we won't go to the answer he quotes Rabbi Yitzchak, and we won't talk about how that answer is used in some parts of the Jewish community today. But the question is a good question. What's that first half of the Torah doing there? In a certain sense, you can divide the Torah that way. There's the first half, which begins Bereshit bara Elokim and goes up to Parshat Bo. That, I would say, is the more universal part of the Torah. Then the specific legislation to Israel begins with Parshat Bo and takes us through Sefer Dvarim. So this more universal part of the Torah, it begins not with the Jews, but with the creation of the world. And of course, it begins with an ancient wisdom tradition. I'm very aware that Abraham Avinu, even though some of the stories we learned about him as an iconoclast, religious revolutionary who destroys everything before him and creates something brand new, every generation of innovators like to think they created something out of whole cloth. But we also know that, no, he studied in the yeshiva of Shem ve'Ever. Remember, Shem and Ever had a yeshiva going, and Avram went there, and Yitzchak went there, which is to say there's a recognition that we come out of the ancient wisdom traditions of humanity that go back to Adam HaRishon, and somebody in each generation preserved the ancient truth. So I want to talk about Bereshit. That's my excuse for in Parshat Bo talking about Bereshit, of course. Creation was the neglected idea in Judaism throughout the 20th century. Jews wanted to talk about a lot of things. They wanted to talk about the Holocaust. They wanted to talk about survival. They wanted to ask the terrible question of where was God. They wanted to talk about authority. Did God really give the Torah? And if not, why did he have to do the mitzvahs? Those were the essential theological questions of Jews in the 20th century. Creation was something on the back burner. We didn't want to talk about it. Why? Because we're embarrassed. We knew we didn't believe the biblical creation story, and we knew we remained very attached to that story. As we pick up our kos every Friday night and say, Vayikulu Shamayim Va'aretz, and we have a relationship to that story that can be described as love, intimacy, loyalty, mythic affiliation, but not belief. We don't believe that's the way the world was created, but we were embarrassed by that dissonance. We were not Scopes trial kinds of people. We weren't people to stand up and say, you may not teach evolution in the schools. We wanted our kids to go to medical school. We think of ourselves as progressive scientific people. And yet at the same time, we had this kind of dissonance, and so there was a certain embarrassment that also, by the way, wasn't a uniquely Jewish problem. It's a problem we had in common with everybody, because the great struggle of traditional religion across the 20th century over the issue of Darwin. Let somebody else worry about it. It wasn't our problem. Of course, that was unlike the great Jewish theologies of the past. The two great Jewish theologies of the Middle Ages, Maimonides on the one hand and the Zohar on the other, everything is about creation. The Rambam understands without creation you don't have miracles, you don't have prophecy, the whole foundation falls without creation. It's why he spent such a long time trying to show that Aristotle hasn't conclusively proven that matter is eternal and principles of physics and so on, because he still wants to maintain the possibility of creation. And the Zohar tells the story of creation over and over again. Everything is about the emergence of the 10 Sfirot. You know, the world came out of the Sfirot. The whole story, the whole narrative of the Zohar is an ongoing repetition of the creation narrative. But in the 21st century, creation is the most important thing to talk about. Because the great task of religion in this century, my friends, is going to be helping us make the transition toward the very great changes in our way of life that we are going to have to undertake. Aggravated by the political responsibility of our so-called leaders early in this century, but extending beyond them. Very simply, if everyone in the world can have the same access to automobiles and air conditioners that we have, we are literally cooked. It can't be that way, and that's going to mean some very great changes. And very great changes in the way we Westerners, we first world people live our lives, I believe will not work if they are legislated from the top by a newly reinforced United Nations that says you may not do this, you may only consume so and so many units of energy per week, and therefore you may only have so many children, and therefore you may only live in so many rooms. I think that's not going to work. It's going to have to come up from below. People are going to have to change. We are going to have to change the way we see ourselves living on this planet. And that is the business of religion. That is exactly what only religion can do, which is to say, enter into the mythic structures of how we understand what human life is about and what we're doing here and what this whole project of being a human being is. Now, some religious leaders are beginning to recognize that. The Pope did a great mitzvah this year.
Yes.
By coming out with this encyclical. It was terribly important. His statement that the forces, the very significant forces of the Catholic Church are committed to this, when, unlike in our community, when the Pope says it, it really happens. We'll see how well it filters down to every parish, but nevertheless, it was tremendous. That was a tremendous breakthrough. The Dalai Lama and some other important religious teachers also understand where we have to go in this and how utterly urgent it is. The greatest resource we have for helping people in our Western traditions, for helping people think about how we live on this planet and how we're going to have to change, is precisely the notion of creation. A sense that we live in a created world, and to appreciate creation. Of course, I don't mean it literally. I mean the old creation story inhabiting the new creation story, which is to say discovering, I now quote from the opening page of the first chapter of Radical Judaism, which I hope more than a few of you have read. I believe that evolution is the greatest sacred story of our time. It's the narrative where the divine waits to be discovered if we open ourselves to it. We Westerners are so involved in the particular stories of our traditions. You know, did Moses get the Torah? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Was Muhammad the chosen messenger? We're so busy with our narratives, we forget the bigger story. The bigger story of how we got here, we human beings, and where we're going, and what this whole human enterprise is about. That's what religion is really about. So discovering, reclaiming that story of evolution, understanding that evolution is the greatest sacred drama of all time. It's the place to discover God. It's the story to convert back into a sacred story. To transform that narrative the same way the Torah once transformed the ancient Near Eastern creation narrative. To say that this is a place where we find God is really a very big piece of the work we have to do. It's Zebek humanism because, of course, it's our universal task. It's using our tradition toward a universal task. Toward a universal task that will be shared with others who will say it in their languages. But we have a special relationship to it because our language, the language of the Hebrew Bible, became the Western world's creation story for 2,000 to 2,500 years. We lived with that story. Western civilization thrived. Maybe some people say distorted the role of humanity because of that story. It can be read in different ways, carried different ways. I'm a lover of the Psalms. Since this is Rosh Chodesh, if we don't say Baruch Nafshi together tomorrow, say it yourself. Psalm 104, it's one of the great pieces of religious poetry and world literature. And it's all about the human being part of a natural world. It's not being over, it's not created for us. We're not the guests at the party. We are completely a part of, completely one with the natural world. So know that. I am here just briefly tonight to ask you to do a mitzvah. I am on a campaign, my friends at Hebrew College and I are on a campaign to recreate an ancient tradition. And to recreate an ancient tradition with a special kavanah. The tradition is called ma'amadot. And ma'amadot, it literally means those who stand up. The tradition of ma'amadot is to recite each day at the conclusion of tefillah the day of creation for that day of the week. On Sunday you finish your davening by saying Bereshit bara Elohim, and on Monday you say Vayomer Elohim Yehi Rakia, and on Tuesday you say Tadshei Haaretz Deshe, until you finally get to Yom HaShishi Vayechulu HaShamayim V'Haaretz. You complete the cycle again. This tradition is called Ma'amadot because there was a group of people called Anshe Ma'amad, described in the Mishnah. You see, the Kohanim were divided up into Mishmarot. And there were 24 groups of Kohanim from the whole priestly population of Israel. And they were divided as to when they had their turn to go do their 2-week tour of duty in Jerusalem. And if you were a Kohen in Anatot in a certain period, you were called up. The Kohanim and Leviim from your city went up. The Kohanim did the service, the Leviim assisted and sang. But the Yisraelim of your community would support the Kohanim. Ma'amad partly meant they would pay for the temple service that week. That was their turn to pay up. But they would also daily recite the days of creation. Because the sacrifices in the temple sustained heaven and earth, the people of that town also decided to sustain heaven and earth by repeating the story of creation. That's why they were called Anshe Ma'amad, and this custom was Ma'amadot. It was revived without the temple and without the people on watch. It was revived in the 16th, 17th century. Somewhere in the back of your very old-fashioned Siddur, you will find Ma'amad Liyom Rishon, Ma'amad Liyom Sheni, and so on. But when they revived it, this was part of the period when they decided, people had the brilliant idea after Tzfat, to turn, after the Tzfat revival, to turn Jewish learning into a ritual. So therefore, every day you should say the day of creation, but also something from Nevi'im and something from Ketuvim, and here's a Mishnah to say, and here's a Gemara, and here's a piece of Zohar to say, and here's a piece from Sifrei Musar to say, and so the Ma'amadot got big and fat, so nobody could possibly say them, and then by the late 19th century, before even the journey to America, they were dropped. And there's almost no synagogue that really says them anymore because they became overly burdensome. As happened with lots of things in Jewish ritual. You know, it became too much, and then you just couldn't do it. Piyutim, for example. So I am calling on us to recreate the original custom. On Sunday, to say at the end of Tfilah, Bereshit bara Elohim, on Monday, Vayomer Elohim Yirkiah, and so on. If you don't daven every day, and there might be one or two people here who are not of that tradition, if you don't daven every day, I suggest it as a Jewish ritual practice, as a daily practice, to say the day of creation, maybe along with a Shema Yisrael. That would be a very nice beginning form of Jewish daily practice. I say it as a way, of course, of reinforcing our awareness of creation, reinforcing our awareness of the things we have to do about it. So on Sunday, with saying the Ma'amad, to think about what it means to live in a created world. But on Monday, to think about the seas and the dry land and what's going on in the seas and how polluted the seas are and those big swirls of garbage in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And on Tuesday, to think about forms of vegetation and what we are doing about vegetation in this world and replanting trees and so on, so that this becomes not only another ritual, but a ritual that somehow leads to action. This is an avodah mivilidei maaseh, something that will lead us to also be more concerned and more involved and more doing. And so I come to you with this appeal to try on something very old and very new. I've been doing it for about 1.5 years or 2 years now, and I find it very enriching of my own spiritual life, and very much an addition to my worship life. So I ask you to think about these things. I ask you to think about what we can do to recreate a Judaism that begins not with a Chodesh Hazeh, and not only with who the Jewish people are and what the Jewish people have been through and gone through, but that takes us back to Bereshit and makes us realize that we have a universal teaching, and a teaching that's alive and important and urgent for life in the 21st century.
Thank you, Art. And if you are